Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Just want to take a very brief moment to do a quick introduction. First, welcome all of you to the Dharma Temple. If you're regulars, welcome back. If you're here for the first time, then you're here on a very special day because you're not stuck listening to me for the next hour. So we appreciate you being here. I want to introduce Dr. Jann Ronis. Very quick story. I don't know, a month or two back, I watched a video. We are generously supported by the Kinsey Foundation, and they have a list of speakers that give talks, part of their lecture series. So I'm watching this guy, and then I don't know, maybe a month later, I get a text saying, "Hey Jeff, I want you to meet this guy Jann. I've known him his whole life, and he's a Buddhist, and I want to connect you to Buddhists." Well, here he is. So
From the same hometown.
From the same hometown, and born just 6 months apart. But it's really a pleasure to have him here. He is executive director of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center out in Boston, correct? It's correct, yeah. And we're just really fortunate to have him here and grateful. This is our first speaker in probably almost 2 years. So aside from everything else, it's just wonderful to finally invite a speaker and have him here safely quarantined in the corner. So they're all yours.
Okay, thanks. All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm sorry I'm crashing your party at very late notice. But hopefully there'll be a little bit for everybody today. I know that we only have an hour, and I'll try to be mindful of the time and just jump right into it. But before starting, I want to thank, of course, Jeffrey and Maggie. As he said, it's just a really cool coincidence that we're both San Diegans, same generation, had similar paths to the Dharma, and know one very important person in common, or a person who's very important in our lives, that just we happen to know totally separately, and who brought us together, and that person being Dean Oliver, an important benefactor of the Dharma Temple, and a member of it as well. So shout out to Jeffrey, Maggie, and Dean Oliver. And because I'm home on winter break and visiting family, my mom gets to be in attendance today. I give a lot of talks, but I never tell her about when they're going to be broadcast live or when the videos are on YouTube. So this is one of her few chances to see me speak. And then lastly, I want to acknowledge the support of the Kinsey Foundation, who supports the temple and also the organization I work for, the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, which I'll say a little bit more about towards the end of the talk. But before we get there, there's some educational content. So I know that today was billed, at least in part, as a kind of intro to Buddhism. Let's still call it that, an intro to Buddhism. But today, rather than talking sort of on the Dharma, rather than giving an actual teaching that conveys the content of the Buddhist teachings themselves, let's instead take one slight step back and focus a little bit more on the materiality of the Dharma. And by that I mean the material culture and the living cultures that created the teachings and have been preserving it over the last 2,500 years. In particular, we're going to focus on manuscripts. There's so much that could be said about the living culture of Buddhism, but we only have an hour, and my organization focuses on manuscripts and texts, the written word. So that'll be the focus of my talk, and I think it should be enough, I hope. So I understand that there's long-timers here. There's no doubt a few people who are here for the first time, or people that would still consider themselves beginners. I hope that I am kind of pitching my talk squarely in the center, so that there's a little bit of something for everyone. All right, let's get going. The title of the talk is Vehicles of the Dharma. Again, Dharma is the Sanskrit word that means the Buddhist teachings. It has a lot of other connotations as well, but for today's purposes, especially for those who are beginners, let's think of it as the Buddhist teachings, the Buddhist gospel, you could even say, the Dharma. And vehicles of the Dharma, for those of you that are long-timers, you'll recognize a Buddhist pun in there, but but don't worry about that. The main thing is that we're going to be discussing Buddhist manuscripts, past and present. I want to start with the origins of the Buddhist scriptural tradition, but then spend the most amount of our time on the present day so that there's a real contemporary relevance to what we're going to talk about. This is not just a history lesson. And so for those of you that are new to Buddhism or who need a little refresher, I'll just remind you that the Buddha lived in North India in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, so 2,500 years ago. And the Buddhists revere the teachings of the Buddha, and his teachings are called the Dharma, as I mentioned before. And so in this context, the Dharma means the teachings, the truth, the law, the standard. And so the Dharma, for our purposes here, originated actually as an oral tradition. The Buddhist teachings weren't always written down, so it originated as an oral tradition. The Buddha himself is not an author, I guess in a way similar to Jesus. There are no records of the Buddha writing anything down. In fact, at that time in Indian culture, there was writing, but writing was reserved for record keeping and more economic and secular needs, not for religious purposes. They thought that the Dharma was too sacred to be committed to writing. And so for 400 years, maybe 500 years, there were generations of monks and nuns who were trained in memorization. They would sit around together and recite the Buddhist scriptures to one another in order to inform their colleagues of the meaning of the Buddhist teachings, but also to train reciters who could then pass it on to the next generation. So the Buddhist teachings for a long time were an oral tradition, and you can hear it in the earliest teachings. They very much have a mnemonic quality. There's a lot of repetition, most of it is in verse, and there's a lot of sort of stock phrases that get repeated over and over again. Exactly what you would expect to find in a tradition that was completely oral. And so the Buddhist teaching, not only was it an oral tradition, but it was also a missionary tradition. From the earliest days, Buddhist monks traveled widely throughout India. Buddha was born and raised and taught in North India, in what we call the Gangetic River Plain, the River Ganges, the holy river of India, but quickly spread far and wide. Some of you might be surprised to hear that Buddhism not only spread from North India southward down throughout India to Sri Lanka and elsewhere, but it also went northward. But most of us actually have already been informed about that through the Bamayan Buddhas, right? Those were the largest outdoor carved Buddha statues in the world, and then in 2001, 2002, they were destroyed. That was a big event. It was quite sad, but the presence of those huge Buddhas should signal to us that it was a thriving Buddhist heartland for a long time. Fortunately, because of the dry and high climate there, the texts that were buried under the ground have survived. And so the archaeologists, scholars who have been looking at these 2,000-year-old manuscripts have determined a lot about the early days and the earliest teachings. It's been quite exciting. I see now that I haven't been paying attention to my PowerPoint. So this is where Buddha was born and spent his time, more or less. And then that's Sri Lanka, where the first teachings were written down. But then, as I was just mentioning, at about exactly the same time, there were also thriving Buddhist communities up north. And we see that they too were writing down their texts, and actually, probably didn't really see a huge moral dilemma in starting to commit the writings and commit the teachings to paper. And furthermore, we see there are a lot of teachings that most likely originated as written documents, not as the oral teachings. So once the Buddhist teachings started to be written down, it sort of opened up the floodgates for creative thinkers and people with sort of new ideas and new sermons to write down what they were thinking. Sometimes they put it in the voice of the Buddha. So it's sort of like what you could call an apocryphal sutra, something that claims to be, from the Buddha, but isn't exactly, but still represents the essence and the heart of the teachings, for sure. And then there are just other writings from this time period that are entirely new genres, because they started to experiment with poetry, with stories, and so forth. Now you may be wondering, well, what are these old texts like? So we don't have anything from Sri Lanka, at least not from 2,000 years ago, but we do have these ancient manuscripts from up north, and the writings were composed on birch bark manuscripts. So they would flatten out bark, treat it for writing, write with some material like some kind of ink. I don't know exactly what it was made of, but ink, and then the teachings were rolled up, and then they were stored in these pots. This is presumably a 2000s, 1900, 1800-year-old pot. You can still see the writings on the outside, and when they were discovered by archaeologists, they were filled with text. Now, some of them were badly decomposed, and they were not, able to be read, but others were treated with all kinds of scientific chemicals and infrared and so forth, and decoded. It's been really amazing. All right, so before we move on, because we're here also to learn about the meaning of the Dharma. I said I wasn't going to talk about it too much, but some of you may be thinking, okay, well, what's in these books? If we're talking about books, that's well and good to know about how they're made and how old they are and how they were transmitted and so forth. But what kinds of things were the Buddhists writing? So a majority of the teachings are sutras. Some of you may know that word, sutras. It means more or less dialogue. These are transcriptions of encounters, dialogues, question and answers, and sermons that the Buddha gave over his 40-year teaching career. So a lot of these texts are sutras. Others are monastic law. So the rules for the monastic assembly. The Buddha was born a prince. Many of you may know this story. Buddha was born a prince. He was the heir apparent, but then he had a religious conversion in his 20s and left the palace and became a renunciant, and then after 6 years of practice became enlightened, and then after that was the Buddha, the teacher. But his tradition survives to this day. It was very successful from the very beginning, and that's largely due to the truth and the power of the Dharma, of the Buddhist teachings. But probably also has a lot to do with the fact that he was raised with a kind of MBA education, right? He was trained to be an administrator. And so he knew how to set up his community so that it would survive him and perpetuate itself and flourish. So the Buddhists are really great at legal codes and canon law. So a lot of the teachings that we would find, because they were written by monks, mainly for monks, they're all about the rules of how you ordain someone, what the rules are, how someone should be punished if they break the rule, how they can be rehabilitated, and so forth. Those are really fascinating. Then naturally there's a lot of treatises on philosophy, guides to contemplation and meditation, narratives. The Buddhists love stories about the Buddha, but mainly about the Buddha's previous lives. Because of the belief in reincarnation, the Buddha and the rest of us have had numerous lifetimes. Most of us were still just normal, regular, sentient beings. And so we can imagine that our past lives have been, not that exemplary. But the Buddha, because he became enlightened and a world-famous teacher, he clearly had been doing things right for a long time. And so one of the favorite teaching tools of the Buddhists going back to this earliest period are stories about the previous life of the Buddha. Often as a human, but just as often as an animal. A rabbit, a tiger, all kinds of different animals. One reason that in India they have so many fables about animals is when you talk about animals, you can sort of get over all of the caste rules that might limit interactions between humans. If you set a story, a moral story, and it's populated with animals of different species, then you can be a little more free about the types of interactions, conflicts, and growth that can happen. But that's just an aside. Then, of course, there's lots of astrology, medicine, secular legal codes, and then lots of art, poetry, drama, and so forth. So much of this has been translated, at least the greatest hits. And maybe if you're interested, let me know afterwards, and I can perhaps put together a biography of interesting Buddhist classics from the earliest days and or 500 years ago that have been translated and are available in English. All right, so earliest books we have are birch bark manuscripts, but then back, let's go from Gandhara, this area, back down to sort of more heartland India. And in India and Southeast Asia for over 1,000 years, up to the present, in many places, the main type of book that was produced was a palm leaf manuscript. So these are books that are written or inscribed on dried palm leaves. So there's a certain type of palm that's best for this. They're cultivated for this purpose. When they get to a certain age, while they're still quite young, they're cut and cut from the tree itself and treated in various ways and cut so that you have a number of pages all uniform shape. Holes are bored through them, and then they're ready for writing. The writing process is a little bit different than how we write with just a felt-tip pen, a ballpoint pen. The palm leaves are somewhat thick, and they're dry, and they just don't absorb ink so well. So what you have to do is first take a stylus, a sharp stylus, and you inscribe the letters and the text that you want to commit to writing. So you carve it into the palm leaves, and then you take powdered ink, sprinkle it over the whole leaf, dust off the ink that hasn't sort of fallen into the grooves, and then you have a legible text. And then you pile up the pages and you tie them together with string that goes through the holes. These palm leaf manuscripts will last about 100 years because of the hot and wet climate. After about a century, they will decompose. And so we don't have a lot of super old palm leaf manuscripts, but because they were always faithfully reproduced generation after generation, the content of the palm leaf manuscripts that survive to this day are quite ancient. And so again, palm leaf manuscripts were ubiquitous in Buddhist India and Southeast Asia. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And so then once you have a bundle, then you store that between wooden boards. Paper was also used, but in East Asia. The Chinese were great at engineering paper technologies. In China, most of the Buddhist texts were written on scrolls of paper, so they make these long strips of paper and then connect many of them into these long strips and then roll them up as scrolls. There are other types of paper books, including accordion folded books. Those are quite interesting. And this is also an accordion book. So you have paper, rectangular horizontal paper. So it's quite narrow, but then if you have this accordion fold, then you can have a height that's double the size of the pages, individual pages. And so you can then use that to have illustrations that span 2 pages, things like that. Just as in medieval Europe, many Buddhist manuscripts from the old days are highly illustrated, as you see here. And then just moving on before we start talking about the issues related to the present day and Buddhist texts. Printing. There are also printed books as well. I've been talking about manuscripts so far, manuscripts being handwritten, but there are also printed books. What you see here is an example of what it is, the earliest datable printed book in the entire world. It's from 688, or was it 866? I sometimes get that confused. But this is the Diamond Sutra. This was discovered in the Gobi Desert by a British explorer and sort of stolen and taken along with many, many other very old texts back to the British Library. But this is universally acknowledged as the earliest datable printed book in the whole world. It's from 866, way before the Gutenberg press and the Gutenberg Bible. Now, this was not done with movable type, but rather it's a xylograph, wood block. So you carve the text backwards into wooden blocks, and then when you press it, it's the right way and can be read. Wood block. And so some of these traditions are still being practiced. Here's a couple of photographs that I took. This is a young man in Tibet who is carving wood blocks at an important traditional printing house. And then on the right, you see a whole row of new woodblock prints they've been edited, they're now ready to be used. And so they're out in the sun to dry out before they're inked and start printing some new texts. Here's an old monk, I took this photo as well, who is pressing pages. You can see he's got a sheet that's the same shape and size as the wood block, puts it down on the inked board, and then presses a roller over it. And the printing is done on both sides of the paper. All right, so I wanted to just give you an introduction first to the materiality of Buddhist books. This is how the Dharma, at least one of the major ways that the Dharma has been composed, recorded, preserved, and transmitted for the last 2,000 years up until the present. These days we in the West or even in kind of the bigger cities of urban Asia, there might be a little bit of a disconnect between the old-fashioned scriptures from the past and the contemporary ways in which the Dharma is being re-explained and made more sort of relevant and modern. But it's important to not lose sight of where it all comes from, especially because our Buddhist brothers and sisters in many places in Buddhist Asia are they feel that these traditions are still really important, that they've been greatly challenged, and that they're worth preserving and supporting. And so now I would like to talk a little bit about efforts to maintain, preserve, and make sustainable Buddhist book culture. And hopefully by the end you'll see that this kind of work is going to enrich all of us by keeping these Buddhist texts alive and available, that in the long run, they will be studied and translated, and the interesting contents that they contain, which have not yet been shared with the rest of us, they'll slowly start to trickle down, and they'll broaden our understanding of contemplation, of the philosophy, the Buddhist teachings, ethics, stories, and so forth. So there's something in them for everybody. But most importantly, for the sustainability of traditional culture and diversity of thought and ideas and literature in the world, it's important that these books be taken care of, and that the people who preserve them be supported as well. And so I'm glad that I haven't been just reading from this script, but let me read something from here so that I don't forget anything. So, Buddhist manuscripts today. One thing that I would like to point out is that unlike, say, in Europe, well, I'll explain the situation in Europe. In Europe, there are many manuscripts. You can go to the British Library, you can go to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, you can go to the Trinity Library in Dublin, and you'll see a lot of ancient manuscripts. They're beautiful, they're illustrated, many of them are in good condition, they can study, republished, all of that. That's great. But you won't really find many ancient manuscripts in cathedrals and temples still being utilized in the traditional way. It's different in many places in Buddhist Asia. There's hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that still survive, fortunately. And where do we find them? Not in museums, not in state libraries, but still in their original homes, in temples, in the personal libraries of monks, and they're not just objects of scholarship, but they're still being studied, chanted, commented on, preached upon, and so forth. So the manuscript tradition is still very much living, and that's something that I think is quite unique, and it also speaks to why it's important to keep it around. And so here's a picture I took of a lama visiting with a friend of mine. You can see all those square type objects behind him are books. So this man has a voluminous library. It's not uncommon in Tibet and elsewhere to find huge caches of books still being preserved, maintained, and venerated, and so forth. That's pretty cool. But books, unlike other types of cultural traditions and material, they take up a lot of space. They're easily damaged. It's costly to maintain them generation after generation. So putting aside war and natural disasters for the time being, the books, they just naturally start to break down on their own. So just as often as you'll see libraries that are well preserved, you will also find in monasteries and elsewhere piles of pages that are in really bad shape. And it's not because of neglect, it's just over 500 years, many collections are going to fall upon hard times. This is a picture from Cambodia. It's a picture of a picture, but these are books that have just kind of fallen on hard times because they're up in the Himalayas and it's probably been flooding and movement and so forth, and so they need to be kind of cleaned up and put back together. But then, over the last 150 years, 200 years in Asia with colonialism, war, civil war, modernity, global warming, and so forth, the textual tradition has been greatly challenged. Here's a picture of pages of palm leaf manuscripts on the floor in a kind of destroyed temple in Cambodia. And now the local people certainly are taking a great interest and responsibility for the texts and trying to gather them back together, clean them up, put them back in the proper order. Here are some local people in Ladakh who have gone to one of these temples that have a pile of pages, and they're trying to recompile them. So that's great. Desktop publishing has been really good for preservation as well. Now you can type in the texts and then reprint them. That's good for preservation and distribution. So here you see on the left a computer input station. Those monks are not just sending emails. They are transcribing old manuscripts. And then on the right, you see a bunch of monks, and they're looking at they're editing the galleys. They're editing a preprint copy of a set of texts that have been typed in. So that's really good as well. And then when you type in the content of a book, then you can press a button and print them out electronically, and you get these nice books that all have, machine cut pages, and you can print as many as are needed and send them out. That's lovely. And so because of the mechanical reproduction of text, a lot of monasteries are now able to rebuild their collections. Fantastic. All right, but only the most important texts are typed in and republished. Only those that have a kind of a Buddhist market value. And that makes perfect sense. But what about the obscure texts, the manuscripts that people don't even really understand that well these days? What about the things that, are very local and so don't have a broad appeal? How can we preserve the local traditions, the texts that are no longer taught actively, but still have a lot of value in terms of literature and culture and history? Well, my organization is trying to tackle this problem through digitization. Digitization being the scanning or the digital photography of manuscripts. Digitization can be done on site. You take a digital camera and a tripod to a monastery in the Himalayas or in Cambodia or Bangkok or somewhere like that, set it up, and on site without having to move the text too far from where they belong. One can, in a day, take good, high quality, high resolution, full color images of an entire manuscript. And if you have a team of people, you can get through a whole library in a short period of time. So it's quick, it's not too expensive. It's something that can be done by the local people themselves. It doesn't disturb the manuscripts too much, and the digital files are easy to distribute far and wide to the entire culture that produced and revered these texts, but also more broadly through the internet to the rest of us. So like I was saying, I work for an organization that does digital preservation. We're called the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, BDRC. BDRC.io is our URL. And we're one of the leading digital conservers and preservers of Buddhist texts. We're not the only one, but we do work pretty broadly. So this is not a sales pitch for us, just because I know our organization better than the others. I wanted to just run through some of our programs so that you get a sense for the vitality and the needs of a couple of Buddhist communities in Asia that have really substantial and important scriptural traditions that should be preserved for a number of reasons, mainly for local sustainability, but also because they have so much to share to the broader Buddhist world. So we have two projects going on these days in Southeast Asia. The first is at a library called the Fragile Palm Leaves Foundation in Bangkok. Sorry for the misspelling, Fragile Palm Leaves. And so this is one of our digitization stations. You can see here two gentlemen sitting at desks with computer screens in front of them, computers on kind of like cranes above them, and then the texts right there at their fingertips being digitized. This is an amazing archive. It has over 11,000 bundles of Burmese texts, and then thousands more in different languages. But the lion's roar of the texts in this collection are from Burma in the Burmese script, and currently we are digitizing all 11,000 bundles. We're at 53% now. It's been a couple of years. It'll be 4 more years before we're done. And so it's just this incredible library that a scholar has amassed over the years. All these texts were endangered or being sold on the black market or on the tourist market and antiquities trade. And so he purchased them in order to save them from being dispersed or broken or lost. And now we're working to digitize them, and we'll digitally repatriate them to Burma, but also make them available to the broader Burmese diaspora and scholars worldwide. So these texts, fragile palm leaves, many of them are hundreds of years old, and before they can be digitized, they need to be treated. So the palm leaves are submerged in water, they're cleaned up, some of them have dust and gunk and so forth on them. Clean them up, then they are oiled and then re-inked. I don't know the sequence. You wouldn't oil them after you ink them. Yeah, so oil them and then ink them and then take a photograph. So there's a lot of labor involved in this project. Not only do we have several people doing the digitization, but we have then a team of people who do the cleaning up. It's painstaking, page by page, but it's important work. We also have a project in Cambodia to digitize Khmer manuscripts on site in Cambodia. The project to do the Burmese text is actually taking place in Bangkok. But in Cambodia, it's a project that's done very much in country. The texts are all local. The staff we have are young people, all with college educations. They have a deep interest in their literature, but not a lot of exposure to it. And so they think it's fantastic that these texts are being digitized, they'll be put online, along with some educational materials that can help them make sense of it. So what we do is go out into the countryside, borrow texts, we borrow them, always return them, of course, borrow texts from the monks who are happy to have them preserved. We bring them back bookshelves and bookcasing and other equipment they might need to better preserve the text from here on out. And this is the workstation. So we use really good lighting and cameras, and then the images are edited before they go online. We have what we call the localized website, the Khmer Manuscript Heritage Project. So this is a freestanding website just for the Khmer manuscripts, and it's in Khmer, French, and English. And it provides an interface that's customized for the particularities of this tradition. So that's one of the things that the donor to this project and BDRC itself feels is really important. We're not here simply to preserve the text, put them in a museum or in an ice box just for longevity, but rather we're hoping that these will be kind of the foundation for a revival of traditional learning, literature, and cultural practice such as ritual. And then just lastly, we have a big project at the National Library of Mongolia. So there are between 30 and 40,000 volumes, Buddhist volumes in the Tibetan language in Ulaanbaatar, in the National Library. The texts were gathered 50, 60, 70 years ago during the Russian period. There was a huge persecution of monks, lamas, Buddhism during this time. A number of manuscripts were destroyed, but not in the same way that they were, say, during the Cultural Revolution in China. Just as, some temples and libraries were targeted, many others were not. And in fact, the Russians went around and gathered up many, tens of thousands of Buddhist manuscripts and brought them to the capital. And they languished for a long time, essentially in the same condition they were in when they were brought in from the countryside. Just texts were taken off the shelves, bundled up roughly, thrown in the backs of trucks, brought to the monastery, and just shoved into a warehouse. But over the last several years, we've been working with the director of the library and their incredible staff to set up this, very efficient digitization workshop, and we're working through hundreds of volumes a quarter, and it's been going well. The text here, in this case, they're in a national library, so that's good in many ways. They have some long-term financial support, but these are still books made of paper, and the warehouse that they're in, it's looked after, but they don't have fire suppression. If there was a fire or a major flood, these could be destroyed easily in a matter of hours. So it's really important that they be digitized just to save them, but also only through digitization that they can be shared more widely with the Mongolian and Tibetan communities, right? This is good, but not ideal. Digitization, cataloging, putting everything online is what we're aiming for. So this is the kind of before and after. This is how everything was a couple of years ago, and now gradually as we go through all the texts, unwrap them, figure out what's in there, recompile things, digitize them, put them, catalog them, give them barcodes and so forth. It's a real gift to Buddhism for generations to come. This is a showroom at the National Library of Mongolia. So in the future, maybe all of the books will be treated like this, but we're certainly making the first steps towards that. And even if the books stay in the warehouse, that's fine. Let's not manhandle them too much. The main thing is that they are available online for free, full color, high resolution, so you can zoom in, download, study, and translate and learn from them. So today I wanted to just introduce one aspect of Buddhist history and Buddhist culture that maybe isn't always talked about in some of the books that you might be reading. The Dharma is this profound truth about human nature and the world and ethics and the cosmos and causality. It certainly transcends language and it transcends culture, but it also has a strong grounding in culture, in the hard work that generations and millions of people have done over the past 2,000 years, and it's important to know where it comes from and to understand some of the challenges, but also appreciate the resiliency and the farsightedness of Buddhists around the world these days. So I think there's a few minutes for questions, but if you want to check out our website or email me if you have a question or concern. I'm Jann@bdrc.io. Our website is bdrc.io. But I just wanted to say that in case you wanted more information. But yeah, let's have an open Q&A, whatever you all are interested in. I think there's about 10 minutes before we have to conclude. Please.
So in your work, you've come across quite a few interesting pieces of texts.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, who do you find to be the most interesting Buddhist scholar, and why?
Well, the most interesting Buddhist scholar. Okay, good.
Whose works you've probably written.
Sure. That's great. I thought you were going to say, which of these traditions of Buddhism do I like the most? The most interesting Buddhist scholar, that's great. Okay, so you're thinking of someone that you might want to follow up on and read?
Who do you find to be interesting?
Yeah. So to keep it within the Kensei Foundation family, the scholar who collected the Fragile Palm Leaves Foundation archive in Bangkok, he's really tremendous. So his name is Peter Skilling. Peter Skilling is a Canadian man. He was a monk for many years in Thailand. Then he worked for the UNHCR for a while with refugees and so forth, and now is just a full-time scholar and translator. So he's very fascinating. Why? Because he knows multiple languages and he's lived in Thailand for like 40 years now. He understands the archaeology, the art history, the murals, the texts. He can read across the different traditions, and so his studies of the Buddhist narratives and then old inscriptions and so forth are quite interesting. So it's good. Then if you ask about other types of scholars, who's doing, really work that's accessible and interesting and draws together different traditions. So I used to be a lecturer at UC Berkeley, and my mentor there, Jake Dalton, Professor Jake Dalton, has an interesting book called, what is the book called? But anyway, it's about Buddhism and violence, and it won an award the year it came out, and it was the first to do a kind of in-depth look at the rhetoric and the practice of violence within Buddhist communities. And so that's a book that, and a scholar who is looking at controversial issues in Buddhism, but in a creative way that appreciates the culture and the history of it, but also is kind of able to draw out some of the ethical implications. So those two scholars are great. Then another one is Sarah Jacoby. She was a classmate of mine from University of Virginia. She has a really fascinating book called Love and Liberation. And it's a detailed study of the autobiography of the most prolific female scholar in Tibetan history. It's a woman who died in the 1930s, 1940s. Her name was Sarah Kondro, S-E-R-A, Kondro, K-H-A-N-D-R-O, but the scholar is Sarah Jacoby, S-A-R-A-H. Sarah Jacoby, she has a book called Love and Liberation, and that's a fascinating book because this woman, is not only kind of unique for having written a 900-page autobiography and having written, thousands of other pages about different topics in Buddhism, but she was also a central person in a dynamic community that practiced esoteric Buddhism. And rarely do you get a firsthand account of the gender relations and the practices of esoteric Buddhism. But this is super detailed, and Sarah spent years on this and brings to light things that otherwise have never been documented before. So I would say those three, yeah. Please.
Can you explain whether Buddhism is a religion or a philosophy?
Yes. Well, what do you think?
Philosophy.
Philosophy. Okay, great. To the degree that Buddhism has temples, priests, scriptures, icons, rituals, and is very concerned about perpetuating itself and its own, cultural integrity, I think it can be classified as a religion. That doesn't mean that in contemporary times that it's not possible to sort of extract philosophical elements and construct a totally valid philosophical system that's rooted in Buddhism. That is happening. But I don't think that describes the totality of Buddhism over the past 2,500 years, and it doesn't really describe much of Buddhism in Asia these days. So those two things are not mutually exclusive. Buddhism is a philosophy for many people now, but it's also a religion.